Well, hello, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about Luther and the Jews. And I think it's important to say at the outset that the Protestant Reformation was an incredible moment in the history of Christianity. And there is ample literature out there talking about the ways in which the reforms brought about by Luther and others were just like a breath of fresh air in the history of Christian thought and Christian practice, and have been ever since, as is evidenced by the ongoing legacy of the Reformation in terms of churches and Christian doctrine ever since. What I'd like to talk about today is kind of the shadow side of not necessarily the entire Protestant Reformation. Today, I'd like to focus specifically on Luther and his doctrine of the Jews. So there is just a brief PowerPoint presentation that we will go through as we try to understand Luther and his doctrine of the Jews. And mostly this PowerPoint presentation is just like a short bibliography of some of the key sources that are relevant to this topic. So first, I want to begin by pointing out a pretty direct connection between Luther's theology and Hitler's ideology, which may or may not be known to some. That's one of the interesting things, is that the shadow side of Luther, sort of like the shadow side of Christian theology in general, dating back to the Council of Nicaea at the latest, I mean, maybe even earlier in terms of the Church Fathers, is very little, it's not often known by Christians in the pews. And so I just want to share with you, there's lots of things we could share in this regard, but I just want to share with you this Nazi propaganda poster, which features Luther with a swastika behind him, two important dates: 1483, the date that Luther was born; 1933, the date that the Third Reich came into power. And it has this slogan underneath it, which, if we translate it sort of roughly, says Hitler's struggle and Hitler's Kampf, as in Mein Kampf, Hitler's struggle and Luther's teaching are the best defense of the German people. And so, as we'll continue to talk about, Hitler very clearly drew upon Luther's thought and theology, which was well known in Germany, in his campaign against the Jewish people, in his murderous campaign against the Jewish people. And we'll unpack that a bit more. But I think it's important, as we recognize the really amazing, positive, again, legacy and aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, there is also this shadow side that is much less talked about and much less known. So I want to highlight two books in particular. One is called Luther and the Jews by my friend and colleague, Richard Harvey, who's a Messianic Jewish scholar who's written a few different books, and he's really honing in on Luther's doctrine of the Jews in this book. And I'll be reading some excerpts from this book in just a moment. And also this book by Christopher Probst on demonizing the Jews. And I'll talk about that in just a moment as well. So I just kind of want to highlight these two books as we continue to discuss Luther and the Jew. There's lots of other sources out there, but I want to highlight these two in particular. So since we've already been talking about the Holocaust and Hitler, I'm just going to read a short excerpt from Demonizing the Jews, the book that you see here on this slide, that's talking about his thesis in this book. So he writes, while the large-scale complicity and indifference of Protestants toward the plight of Jews in the face of dire events in Nazi Germany have been established previously, Luther's anti-Semitism as a contributor to these attitudes and actions often is either assumed as a given or left unexamined. I will demonstrate here via carefully situated case studies that a significant number of pastors, bishops, and theologians of varying theological and church political persuasions utilized Luther's writings about Jews and Judaism with considerable effectiveness to reinforce the cultural anti-Semitism and Christian anti-Judaism already present in substantial degrees among Protestants in Nazi Germany. We'll come back in just a moment and talk a little bit about definitions, because we just talked about anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. What's the difference? How are they connected? We'll come back to that in just a moment. He goes on to write, further, I will show that anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism were intertwined both in the Reformers' writings and in those of his theological descendants in Nazi Germany. So that's basically his thesis. He wants to really tease out the influence that Luther had in Nazi ideology and in the perpetuation of both Nazi anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. Let's just talk for a moment about these definitions, and then I'll come back and read a little bit, and we'll really get into what did Luther have to say about the Jews. So in general, anti-Judaism, and anti-Judaism we see much earlier than we see anti-Semitism. There's sort of a chronological progression that we see in history, and particularly in Christian theology and thought. So in general, anti-Judaism is an aversion to the Jewish religion, the practice of Judaism. We see this all the way back to the church fathers, where there's a lot of vitriolic thought against Judaism as a religion. Anti-Semitism is an aversion, generally speaking, to Jews as a racial or ethnic group. So the part of the distinction is that a Jew can sidestep anti-Judaism by ceasing to practice Judaism. And we see this particularly in the Enlightenment, when many Jews, when you get the emergence of so-called secular Judaism, where Jews just sort of walk away from any Jewish practice or Jewish identity markers. So a Jew can sidestep anti-Judaism by ceasing to look or act as a Jew, whereas nothing a Jew can do allows them to escape anti-Semitism. And this is more of what we see happening in the Holocaust. It didn't matter if you were an Orthodox Jew, a practicing Jew, a rabbi, anybody with any sort of drop of Jewish blood was targeted in the Holocaust. And so this excerpt we were just reading from the Demonizing the Jews book, he's talking about how we actually see both in Luther, and we see both carried over in Hitler's ideology. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time just sort of unpacking what does Luther have to say about the Jews. And again, this book, Luther and the Jews, is just a really good, very short, brief overview of Luther's thought on the Jews and his progression on the on thought on the Jews. So I'm going to read kind of a long excerpt from this that we'll unpack, and then I'll read some other little bits as well from this book. He writes, Luther inherited an anti-Jewish tradition stretching back to the time when the church became majority non-Jewish and marginalized and anathematized its Jewish members. The Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. God was punishing them for their sin of unbelief, and the church had now taken over as the new Israel. This is sort of like core Christian thought on the Jews, again, going back to the patristic era. Now the Jews were condemned to wander the earth with no land of their own and to await the judgment that would fall upon them at the return of Christ. So the negative stereotypes about the Jews continued in Christian Europe, and Luther grew up knowing and believing the scandalous stories that were told about Jews. They were not only money lenders, a trade forbidden to Christians, but also swindlers, crooks, and worse. They kidnapped Christian children to torture and murder them. This is going back to like accusations from the Middle Ages against the Jews. You get this sort of blood libel accusation, which is what he's talking about here. There's this terrible, again, history of Christian thought and theology against the Jews that many Christians today are not aware of, but Jews are very aware of this. They used the children's blood in their Passover sacrifices. They poisoned wells, and they were responsible for the Black Death and other disasters. They practiced magic and sorcery using their secret books, the Talmud and the Kabbalah, which should either be refuted or destroyed. Worst of all, they obstinately insisted on rejecting the truth of the gospel and rather chose to blaspheme, insulting and smearing the Virgin Mary and Jesus himself, saying that he was a false prophet. This is just sort of telling us the context that Luther was born into. This was all already existing before Luther came along. Luther would also have heard how Jews would profane the wafers used at communion and was familiar with stories of them stealing the consecrated bread, piercing it, and using it for their Passover service. Such stories were widely circulated and believed. In 1510, such a story was printed and distributed and led to the arrest and sentencing to death of 42 Jews in Brandenburg. With such beliefs held by many in the Middle Ages, it is no wonder that Luther's own views are strongly colored by negative perceptions. He also had no contact with Jews and met only a few in his life who themselves had become Christians and were alienated from their people. So again, this is just giving us some context for Luther's, again, nothing that Luther's created on his own yet. It's just what the world that Luther is born into in terms of Christian perspectives on the Jewish people. Now, I think this last point is also very important, that Luther never actually knew Jews, except maybe a couple who had become Christians and had sort of left behind Judaism, which was in many cases required for Jewish converts to Christianity for hundreds of years. And so there's another scholar, a scholar named Jeremy Cohen, who coined this term, the hermeneutical Jew. And what he means by that is the way that Jews and Judaism function in Christian theology, which is actually very different from the reality of Jews and Judaism. And we see this flourishing in the Middle Ages and some of these ideas that Richard Harvey just talked about here, the blood libel, piercing the host, taking the blood of Christian children for Passover sacrifices. This all is like this Christian flourish. It causes Jews and Judaism to sort of play a certain role in Christian thought and theology, which is always sort of over against Christianity. That's not representative of the reality of Jews and Judaism. So this term hermeneutical Jew, I want us to kind of hold on to that, because it's important to note that this kind of outlandish, outrageous portrayal of Jews and Judaism, it's a theological category. It doesn't have legs that sort of touch down in terms of real Jews and real Jewish practices. So in this book, Harvey then goes on to talk about Luther's main writing about the Jews. And there's a number of different places where Luther wrote about the Jews. But I just want to highlight a couple of them. So early on, Martin Luther wrote a tractate or kind of a book called That Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew. And many scholars actually want to say that Luther had a very positive notion of the Jews early on in his life, and he became much more anti-Semitic as his life went on. What Harvey wants to argue, and I think he argues it convincingly, is that the seeds of his really terrible venom against the Jews was actually already there in his earlier writings. It got more pronounced in his later writings, but Harvey wants to argue that it was already there. And so in his 1523 essay that Jesus Christ was born a Jew, Luther condemned the inhuman treatment of the Jews and urged Christians to treat them kindly. He goes on to sort of offer an excerpt from this where he says, if this is an excerpt from Luther's tractate That Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew, Luther writes, if I had been a Jew and had seen such dolts and blockheads govern and teach the Christian faith, I would sooner have become a hog than a Christian. They have dealt with the Jews as if they were dogs rather than human beings. They have done little else than deride them and seize their property. When they baptize them, they show them nothing of the Christian doctrine or life, but only subject them to poppishness and mockery. If the apostles, who were also Jews, had dealt with us Gentiles as we Gentiles deal with the Jews, there would never have been a Christian among the Gentiles. So you can see there's some positive imagery and language here. And this goes very much hand in hand with Luther's, and we'll talk about this more in a few minutes, with Luther's venom against the Catholic Church, right? So here he's indicting the Catholic Church for its treatment of the Jews, which he will later sound very much like himself. So in any case, there are some places where he sounds very positive, and interestingly, his criticism of the Roman Catholic Church and the way it had treated Jews actually led him to be labeled as a Judaizer in his own context, which is sort of ironic given that the turn that his thought will take. So I want to skip now, and he did write relevant things in between, but I want to skip to this later writing of his, which is called On the Jews and Their Lies, where sort of any shred of positive sounding thought or theology toward the Jews has just completely gone. And so here it's just unbelievable what he says. And it looks like, oh, I forgot to put a slide in here. I'll try to show it to you, or I'll just read this for you. In this book, Harvey offers a list of basically the recommendations that Luther makes in this tractate on the Jews and their lives. And to civil authorities, Luther advocates that they burn down synagogues, destroy Jewish homes, confiscate prayer books and Talmudic writings, the central writings of Rabbinic Judaism, forbid rabbis to teach, abolish safe conduct for Jews, prohibit usury to the Jews, and enforce manual labor on the Jews. Like, does this sound familiar at all? And to pastors and preachers, Luther advocates that they burn down synagogues, confiscate prayer books and Talmudic writings and the Bible, prohibit Jewish prayer and teaching, and forbid Jews to utter the name of God publicly. And all of this for Luther is based upon this accusation that Jews have misunderstood their own scriptures and that their understanding of it is actually dangerous for Christians to even be exposed to, which is why he goes to such great lengths. And so this tractate is just really terrible. And again, I sort of wonder how many Christians today are even aware of this shadow side of Luther. And so in conclusion, and again, this is really skimming over a lot of this content just for the sense of giving us a sense of what Luther had to say about the Jews. So this is, again, a list from Harvey's book. He says, we can summarize Luther's lies about the Jews as follows. Number one, God has finished with the Jews because of their rejection of Jesus Christ. Number two, this is again a summary of Luther's teachings. Number two, the Jews deserve to be punished, and it is a Christian's duty to remove them from their lands, destroy their places of worship and holy books, not permit them safe passage, etc. Number three, the Jews are in league with the devil to poison wells, kidnap and sacrifice Christian children for their rituals, desecrate the communion wafers, infect the wells, and pass on the plague. So Luther had a lot to say about the devil in his writings, and part of the problem with the Jews is that for Luther, they're sort of in cahoots with the devil as this sort of rejected and forsaken people by God, and that's one of the big problems with them. Number four, the Jews mistranslate and distort the meaning of their own scriptures, the Hebrew Old Testament. Again, this goes back to the patristic era in terms of accusing Jews of not understanding their own scriptures. And number five, the Jews lie when they say that Jesus is not the Messiah. So that's just a bit of an overview of Luther's teaching on the Jews. And we can sort of understand, given those recommendations that he makes, why there would in some ways be this straight line from Luther to Hitler, and why Hitler would really capitalize on Luther's thought in his own anti-Semitic extermination of the Jewish people. And so I just want to reiterate, it is a common argument to make that Luther sort of wasn't so anti-Semitic in his earlier writings, like that Jesus Christ was born a Jew. And then he sort of he wanted all the Jews to convert to Christianity, and then people will say that by later in his life he saw that that wasn't happening, and so he got more and more and more kind of negative and antagonistic toward the Jews. I think Harvey makes an important case in this book. You already see the seeds of negative theology toward the Jews in his early writings because of the context in which he himself was raised. It's not just that we can draw a line from Luther to Hitler. We can draw a line from patristic theology to medieval theology to Reformation theology to the Holocaust. So it goes back a lot farther than just Luther. So that's just a little bit of a kind of an overview of some of Luther's thought and theology with regard to Jews and Judaism. There's one last point that I want to touch on today, and that is Luther and Paul. And I want to talk a little bit about contemporary Pauline studies. And again, this is just a sample. I've given you 4 books here, but there's lots of books in this vein. And so I want to highlight these 4, which I could have chosen, a lot of other ones, but I think these are significant. And so let me unpack this a little bit. Part of what happened in Luther's theology is, Luther is rightly frustrated with the Catholic Church and with inequality in the Catholic Church, corruption in the Catholic Church. And so what Luther does is he reads the New Testament and he sees, he reads Paul as being in a similar situation to Luther. So Luther ends up having this radical break with the Catholic Church, and he reads his own story back into Paul. So he reads Paul as having all of these grievances against a corrupt Judaism, and finally having this radical break with that corrupt Judaism. And for the rest of his life, sort of touting the riches of Christianity over against Judaism. This is Luther's reading of Paul. He reads his own situation and his own angst against the Catholic Church back into Luther's situation in terms of Second Temple Judaism. And that reading of Paul gains a lot of traction, and it becomes what's called the traditional reading of Paul. So for 400 years after Luther, that is the way that Paul is just understood. Paul had this radical break with Judaism. Paul, spent his letters in the New Testament sort of dismantling Judaism and touting why Christianity is better. And what that does is it presumes a very early dating of the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity, that you can already say that there was this Christianity that was over against this Judaism. Contemporary scholarship is increasingly, and I think very persuasively, arguing that the parting of the ways came much later, right? We see these patristic authors. We see the First Council of Nicaea. We see the Second Council of Nicaea, where kind of official church theology is still teasing out and kind of hammering in this negative stance over against Judaism. But in any case, Luther read that all into Paul, and that became the traditional reading of Paul. Now, in the latter half of the 20th century, we get a whole new array of understandings of Paul. And this happens for a number of reasons. First of all, we have the Holocaust, which causes Christians all over the world to really scratch their heads and say, what went wrong? How was Christian theology kind of implicit in Hitler's ideology, and how was Christian theology complicit with Hitler's program? And so the Holocaust is really kind of this wake-up moment to Christians, and there were a few Christians who stood up against Hitler. You have people like Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but the Catholic Church makes an accord with Hitler, and so by and large, the Christians are not standing up against what Hitler's doing. And that causes kind of a ethical crisis for Christians in the aftermath of the Holocaust. You also have the creation of the modern state of Israel in the aftermath of the Holocaust, which becomes this major event, because Luther was one of the people who was like, Jews, you are never going to get your land back. The Jews have been praying to have their own sovereign land since, the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 AD. And Luther was like, it's never going to happen. Get over it. It's part of your rejection by God. And so the creation of the modern state of Israel in 1948 becomes another pointed question mark for Christian theology. What does it mean that for the first time in 2,000 years, the Jews have a sovereign nation? What does that mean in terms of biblical prophecy? What does that mean in terms of what we read in our Bibles about the connection between the Jewish people and the land? Maybe God hasn't rejected the Jewish people. So this becomes another catalyst for rethinking these. You also have the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s, where the Catholic Church really begins to scratch its head and think anew about these terrible longstanding doctrines against the Jewish people. And you get key documents like Nostra Aetate that are issued at the Second Vatican Council, where the Catholic Church begins to chart a new direction in terms of relating to the Jewish people and Judaism as a religion, and begins to renounce its long-standing supersessionism, whereby the belief is held that the church kind of replaces the Jewish people as God's chosen people. There's other factors as well, but those are three that are really worth mentioning. And so in the aftermath of all of that, you get what's called a new perspective on Paul, where New Testament scholars begin to sort of rethink, maybe we got Paul wrong. And it kind of just continues to go in that direction. You get the new perspective on Paul, you then get the radical new perspective on Paul, and then you get what's called the Paul within Judaism camp, which is basically saying that Paul never left Judaism behind, that Paul was a Torah observant Jew until the day that he died. And it leads us to an entirely new understanding of key concepts in Paul's letters, if we take that as a starting point, that Paul did not leave Judaism behind in the way that Luther kind of read his own story of leaving the Catholic Church behind into Paul. And so part of what we see in this new generation of scholarship is a whole host, a whole group of Jewish New Testament scholars. There are Messianic Jewish New Testament scholars, but there's also just Jewish New Testament scholars who don't even believe in Jesus, but have PhDs in New Testament. People like Amy Jill Levine, Pamela Eisenbaum, Paula Fredrickson, Mark Nanos. I mean, these are all people who are kind of leading this new school of Pauline thought. Most of them are now under the umbrella of what's called Paul within Judaism. And they're reading the New Testament from Jewish eyes, and they're seeing entirely different things. I'll just give you one example. One of the things that they're seeing, they're saying, wait, who was Paul writing to? In places where Paul seems to be saying really negative things against the law, who was he writing to? And one of the things that they're arguing, I think convincingly, if we read Paul's letters, is that he was talking to Gentiles. And he was sort of reinforcing what we see in the Acts 15 Jerusalem Council, was that Gentiles are not required to take on Jewish practice. And so just that question alone of audience, who's Paul talking to? He's not talking to Jewish followers of Jesus like himself. He's talking to Gentiles. And he's basically telling them, you don't have to take on the law in order to be followers of Jesus. So there's a lot here in terms of Pauline scholarship. And so I'm just highlighting these books, Paul Within Judaism, an edited volume by Mark Nanos and Magnus Zetterholm, both of whom are leading scholars in this Paul Within Judaism camp. Matthew Thiessen's book, Paul and the Gentile Problem, which kind of approaches Paul also from a similar vein. Pamela Eisenbaum's book, Paul Was Not a Christian, which is a pretty provocative title. And then this book that's a slightly outdated by Magnus Zetterholm called Approaches to Paul, which I think is just a really good introduction to what I've just said, the traditional perspective on Paul, which is essentially Luther's perspective, and the way in which in the latter half of the 20th century, we get entirely new readings of Paul. So the point with regard to Luther and the Jews is that it's not just that Luther has this terrible theology of the Jews, it's that Luther kind of sets the stage for Pauline theology all the way up until post-Holocaust, when the theology of Paul begins to change and develop, which is very much what we see in our day. So again, we will conclude there. I want to say part of the challenge when we're looking at Christian theology vis-a-vis Jews and Judaism is to kind of hold on to this tension between Luther's incredible influence in the history of Christian thought and the legacy that he still holds to this day, while still acknowledging this shadow side of Luther's thought, as we've seen and as these books unpack, and the ways in which Luther contributes to a very dark, destructive thread of Christian thought and theology that, again, in some ways directly informs the Holocaust. So we will end there.